Life of the first humans. The Deluge, tomb of the ancient world, which resurrects anew. Humankind has fallen, but it must rise again. It has become corrupted by its own fault, but it must heal through God's grace. This is not a mechanical healing of the body, but a free and voluntary healing of the soul. The patient must desire it and commit to it. For this, they must feel the full depth of their illness, the disorder of their will, the darkening of their intelligence. The physician will therefore let the disease run its course and release all its venom. Only at certain periods will they apply some preparatory remedy to direct its crises, even the most violent ones, toward the final healing. As humankind does not live for just one day, but through all temporal centuries, its restoration will only be completed over time. Its physician never loses sight of it, and this physician is God, who, at the appointed time, will make himself the remedy. The progress of this disease and its cure, the art of the physician who turns obstacles themselves into means, this is the true object of human history. Without this, it may well present some interesting particulars, but the whole will have no meaning. This history properly begins here, for it is here that the development of good and evil in humankind properly begins. Birth of Cain and Abel. Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, which means acquisition, saying, I possess, I have acquired, I have begotten a man from God. In the literal Hebrew, I have acquired, I have begotten, I possess a man who is Jehovah. Eve describes her firstborn not as a child, but as a man he is, according to her, Jehovah the one who is. God had announced that the woman's son would crush the serpent's head. He had implied that this son would be a God-man. Eve, still full of these words of mercy, believes herself to be this blessed mother. She believes her son to be this God-man. Hence this joyful exclamation, I have brought into the world the man Jehovah. But the first will be the earthly man. The heavenly man will come only after. It seems that our mother soon realized her error, for, having brought into the world a second son, he received the name Abel, which means vanity or mourning. However, this younger son, if he was not the one who is justice and holiness itself, was to be a resembling figure both in his life and in his death. Abel was a shepherd of sheep, and Cain was a farmer, literally in Hebrew, servant or slave of the earth. Now it came to pass after some time that Cain presented fruits of the earth as an offering to Jehovah. Abel also presented an offering of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat. And Jehovah turned his gaze toward Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he did not look upon it. Each of the two brothers offers his sacrifice. Their common father, perhaps God himself, had taught them the obligation and manner of doing it. Abel, as interpreters have noted, offers the first fruits of his flock and the best he had, but there is no mention of first fruits in Cain's sacrifice. One can conclude that he kept them for himself and only offered God what was left. This outward difference had its source within. Abel was animated by a more lively faith, that is why, says St. Paul. He offered a more precious sacrifice. Thus God publicly testified that he recognized him as righteous by visibly accepting his gifts. It is commonly thought that this was done by consuming them with fire from heaven, as he did with the first sacrifice of Aaron, first pontiff of Israel. One can believe that Adam's two sons presented their oblation to God, turned towards the earthly paradise from which their father had been driven out, and before which the cherubim were placed as before an inaccessible sanctuary. Perhaps it was from among these flaming cherubim that the flame came which consumed Abel's sacrifice, just as it was from the Holy of Holies that the flame came which consumed Aaron's sacrifice, newly consecrated pontiff of Israel. Jealousy, hardening, fratricide, impenitence, and punishment of Cain. Seeing the difference that God made between his offering and that of his brother, Cain was violently irritated, and his countenance fell. But the Lord said to him, Why art thou irritated, and why is thy face downcast? If thou doest well, shalt thou not receive thy reward? If thou doest evil, sin shall lie at the door, its desire shall aspire towards thee, but thou mayest master it. Cain becomes envious of his brother, because his brother is righteous, and his works are good, while his own are evil, as is his heart. Perchance he saw in this preference that God had shown to Abel's sacrifice an indication that he chose him as priest and universal pontiff of the human race. A father of the Church effectively names Abel the first priest or pontiff of this primordial universe. Thus, and for the same reasons, shall we see the Jew become jealous of Christ, the quintessential righteous one. God, always good, reminds Cain that if his offering was not received with the same favor, he should only blame himself. Everything is in his hands, good and evil, reward and punishment. If he does not do well, sin will besiege his door like an unclean animal that only seeks to reach him to make him its prey. However, if he wishes, even then, he will still be able to dominate this hideous monster. Cain did not benefit much from divine reprimand. One day he said to Abel, his brother, Let's go out. And when they were in the countryside, Cain rose against his brother Abel and killed him. This is how the first murderer, out of jealousy, puts to death the first righteous man. We will see another Cain, the Jewish people, equally jealous, leaving Jerusalem with their brother the righteous one, the Holy One, the Christ, and having arrived in the fields, putting him to death on Calvary. Then Jehovah, or the Eternal, said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? He replied, I do not know, am I my brother's keeper? But the Eternal said to him, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries from this earth up to me. Now therefore you shall be cursed from this earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood shed by your hand. If you cultivate it, it will no longer yield its fertility to you. You shall be wandering and fugitive in the universe. Cain then said to the Eternal, My iniquity is too great to deserve pardon, according to some interpreters. The punishment for my iniquity is too great for me to bear. Behold, you drive me today from this earth. I must hide from your face. Therefore, when I shall be wandering and fugitive in the universe, whoever finds me will kill me. It shall not be so, replied the Eternal. Whoever kills Cain shall be punished sevenfold. And the Eternal put a mark on Cain, so that whoever found him would not kill him. So Cain went out from the presence of the Eternal, and dwelt in the land of Nod or Flight, east of Eden. God questions not as one who is ignorant, but as a judge who wants to convince and punish a criminal. He had seen everything, nevertheless. He questions Cain as he had questioned Adam. He listens to their defense before condemning them. Through his example, he wanted to teach human justice how it should proceed even with regard to a murderer. Where is Abel, your brother? A simple and paternal question, which awakens every day in the hearts of brothers and sisters what friendship has most tender. But what a thunderbolt for Cain! Such is already his hardening that he is neither struck down nor touched by it, but responds with insolence. I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? What a difference between guilty Adam and his criminal son. Adam blushes at the consequences of his fault. He confesses it. Cain is so hardened in his crime that he goes so far as to insult his judge. Thus the sentence is very different. Adam was not cursed. Cain will be. A terrible curse drives him from the land that he has soaked with his brother's blood, and condemns him to a wandering and fugitive life. Then Cain indirectly admits his crime, saying that it is too great for him to obtain pardon or bear the punishment. But what primarily occupies him is the fear of being killed. He felt well that he deserved it. God reassures him on this point. As sole master of life, he permits no one to take Cain's life. He wants, through the fugitive and trembling life of this first murderer, to inspire horror of murder in all men. To increase this horror further, he announces that whoever kills him would be punished 7 times more. As for the mark that God puts on Cain, it is commonly believed, according to the Greek version, which states, "You will be groaning and trembling on the earth," that it was a horrible trembling of all his limbs that frightened spectators, especially in reminding them that a punishment 7 times more terrible was reserved for whoever would kill this wretch. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod, or of flight, to the east of Eden. We can see from these last words, as well as from other similar ones, that the land of Eden was regarded by the first humans as their center, their cradle, their common homeland. In this country was the garden of God, at the entrance of which were placed the cherubim. Adam had been driven from the garden or paradise, but it is not said that he was driven from Eden itself. It is likely that our first parents, banished from earthly paradise, settled nearby in the country that enclosed it. It is likely that, in their prayers and sacrifices, they turned their gaze toward this kind of sanctuary, where they had lived familiarly with their Creator, but of which they now saw only the formidable appearance of the cherubim. Perhaps it was from atop these mysterious cherubim, as from his throne, that God questioned Cain, perhaps, when it is said that Cain withdrew from before the face of the Eternal. It should be understood that he withdrew from before this throne of his glory, and that he even left the land of Eden, being both excommunicated and banished, cut off from divine worship and human society. Be that as it may, it is nonetheless true that, among all peoples of antiquity, the gravest offenders, murderers, and patricides were simultaneously excommunicated and banished, excluded from religious ceremonies and social interactions. People feared finding themselves under the same roof, or within the same vessel as these individuals. They feared being enveloped in the same divine punishment that relentlessly pursued them. Philosophers, historians, poets, all are replete with such ideas and similar examples. This belief is found even among those least familiar with philosophy and science. Thus, the pagans of the island of Malta, upon seeing St. Paul survive a shipwreck only to be struck by a viper, said among themselves, "He must surely be a murderer, since, having escaped the sea, vengeance does not permit him to live." The foundation of this belief is truth itself. God's vengeance pursues the sinner both in time and in eternity, in one to make them look within themselves, in the other to punish their impenitence. All of mankind is in the first case. Satan, with his angels, is in the second. The first centuries of the world had a visible example in one man. We have before our eyes an even more terrible example in an entire people. Abel and Cain, figures of Jesus Christ and the Jewish people. The people beloved by God, the Jewish people, in the fury of their jealousy, killed Christ their brother, leader of the younger people, the Christian people. 18 centuries have passed since this crime. For 18 centuries, God and men have asked this other Cain, "Where is your brother? Where is the Christ, who was to be born of your blood, and according to the prophets convert all nations to God?" And for 18 centuries, he answers with the obstinacy of the first fratricide, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And he speaks more truly than Cain. He does not know where Christ is. He does not see what everyone sees. He does not see that instead of being his faithful keeper, he was his guilty murderer. He no longer remembers his own imprecation. "May his blood be upon us and our children." He does not see that with this blood weighs on his head the blood of all persecuted righteous ones, beginning with that of Abel. However, how can he not see it, when in the past he had filled the measure of his iniquity through frequent relapses into idolatry, God punished him with a 70-year captivity in Babylon. Now it has been 26 times 70 years that he has been driven from his city and his country, scattered throughout the earth, without king, without priest, without altar, without sacrifice, without form of people, everywhere wandering and fugitive, everywhere despised and trembling. What is this crime greater than all his crimes? Everyone tells him that the blood he shed 18 centuries ago cries for vengeance against him, but that, if he wishes, it will cry for his mercy. Terrified of this terrible light, he dares not fix his gaze upon it. A law was given to him, a land once flowing with milk and honey. He cultivates it, he works its surface, he keeps its exterior. Circumcision, Passover, Sabbath. But this land is struck with sterility for him. It has lost for him its milk, its honey, its soul, its life, which is Christ. Thus accused of deicide by the voice of the universe, finding nothing in his law that reassures him, he falls into a secret despair. No more than Cain, he will not ask God for mercy. His only fear, like that of Cain, is that whoever meets him might kill him. But God, who wants to make him a striking example of his justice and an irrefutable witness to his truth, has provided for it. He has placed a mark on him, as once on Cain, a stubborn and inexplicable attachment to a law that is his condemnation, and even in his exterior, a haggard physiognomy that distinguishes him from all other peoples. Thus the Romans will come and submit all nations to their laws and customs. The barbarians will come and change all customs and laws. Scholars and politicians will come and do everything to make the Jewish people another people. But neither Roman power, nor barbarism, nor civilization will be able to do anything about it. The Jew will always remain a Jew. He will be despised, oppressed, persecuted, even flattered sometimes, but never will anyone be able to change or exterminate him. He must be there for the instruction of the universe. A remarkable thing. Despite heaven's warning, Cain kills his brother. This horrific crime seems to contradict the designs of providence, and yet it only fulfills them. In Abel, humanity offers God its first fruits. The first death is that of a righteous man, a saint, a martyr. The earth now has an intercessor in heaven. Heaven and earth are reconciled with each other. Even Cain, if he wishes, will obtain mercy. A long life is given to him as punishment for his crime, and to teach the first world that if man is free to do good or evil, God is also just to reward or punish him. Following Cain's example, the Jewish people kill Christ. This crime, the greatest of crimes, seemingly overthrows the designs of the Most High, and yet it only executes them. Through Christ's death, the serpent's head is crushed, man is saved, and God is honored as much as he deserves. The deicidal people themselves, when they wish, will participate in eternal salvation. Meanwhile, they will serve as a lesson and example. Cain's posterity, discoveries, polygamy. After Abel's death, Scripture tells us briefly about Cain's posterity. It indicates 7 generations, but without marking any periods or years. Cain, having known his wife, had a son named Enoch. Later he built a city, which he named after his son. The fear of being killed for his murder perhaps made him build a city as a place of safety. His 5th descendant was named Lamech. He broke the primitive unity of marriage by taking 2 wives at once, Ada and Selah. The first bore Jabal, father of those who live in tents and of shepherds, and Jubal, father of those who play the harp and zither. The second gave birth to Tubal-Cain, skilled in working with iron and brass, and a daughter called Noema, or the Beautiful One. Tubal-Cain and his sister are found, according to some, in Vulcan, the famous blacksmith in poetry, and his wife Venus, symbol of carnal beauty. Whatever the case, Lamech said one day to his two wives, Ada and Selah, "Hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, listen to my words. I have killed a man for my wound, and a youth for my bruise. But if Cain is avenged 7 times, Lamech will be 70 times 7. It is generally agreed that there is a certain poetic measure in these words, and it is easy to notice, but one does not know exactly what they mean. What seems certain, according to the original text, is that Lamech killed a grown man and a child, not deliberately, but by accident or in self-defense. From this, he concludes that if Cain, who had killed his brother with premeditation, was nevertheless to be avenged 7 times upon whoever would kill him against God's prohibition, he, Lamech, should be avenged incomparably more. We can see that the story of the first murderer was not forgotten among his descendants, and that it even produced some good effects. Thus, Cain hides his crime, boldly denies it before God who questions him, while Lamech, without being questioned by anyone, confesses his and appeals to God's justice, to be punished only by him. However, murder continued in the race of Cain, and it was there that the first breach was made in the holy and primitive unity of conjugal union. What can also be observed there is the origin of castes and hereditary professions. The descendants of Jabal are nomadic shepherds, those of Jubal, musicians, and those of Tubal-Cain, miners and metalworkers. Abel is reborn in Seth and Jesus Christ in his church. Abel was dead, but he was to be reborn in another version of himself, and by this kind of substitution perpetuate his lineage until us. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and she gave him the name Seth, meaning substituted, saying, God has substituted another lineage for Abel, whom Cain killed. Adam had lived 130 years, according to the Hebrew, according to the Septuagint version, when he begat this son in his image and likeness, and named him Seth from this. It is presumed that Abel was killed in the year 128 or 129 of his father's life. At this time, Adam undoubtedly already had more than one son and more than one daughter. His posterity was probably already quite numerous. What suggests this is that Cain feared being killed by anyone he might meet. Some authors have even calculated that at Abel's death, 1 year before Seth's birth, there must have been more than 4,000 souls on earth. Some even put this number at up to 100,000. A notable peculiarity is that, according to the name given to him by his father and mother, Seth is a race substituted for his brother Abel, a posthumous race, so to speak, of the first righteous one. Thus, the righteous one par excellence, after dying on the cross, saw himself reborn in the Christian people. Seth appears in all this as Abel's representative and his vicar. Now, what is greatest in Abel is that through his sacrifice and death, both as priest and victim, he was the figure of Christ, eternal priest and victim sacrificed since the world's beginning. Seth could therefore be considered as Christ's representative and vicar in the primitive church. It is said that Adam begat him in his image and likeness. These words may mean that Adam begat him similar to himself through sin, and not similar to God through original righteousness. However, as these words are only said of Seth, it is natural to think they contain rather a particular prerogative, presumably to be, after Adam, the spiritual chief and doctor of mankind. This is at least how Eastern traditions represent him. Josephus, the Jewish historian, reports that in his time there still existed 2 columns on which Seth had engraved the summary of the most useful knowledge, whatever the truth of. This assertion, it still proves that this patriarch was generally regarded as the universal teacher of the primitive world, and as the faithful depository of original traditions. at the age of 105 years, according to the Hebrew and Vulgate texts, or 205 years according to the Greek Septuagint, Seth fathered a son whom he called Enos. Then, according to the original text, people began to invoke the name of Jehovah, or alternatively, they began to call upon the name of Jehovah. The Latin version translates it slightly differently. He began to invoke the name of the Lord. According to common interpretation, these various meanings are equally true. It was during the time of Enos, probably through his exhortations and under his leadership, that people began to honor the Eternal One through public worship and regular assemblies. It was, in all likelihood, around the same time that the Society of the Faithful received or took the name of Children of God, which we will soon see. In any case, it would be a false exaggeration to imagine, according to the current text of the Vulgate, that Enos was the first to invoke the name of the Lord. Adam and Seth were still alive, who certainly had not forgotten God, nor ceased to invoke his name. An illustrious father of the Church, Saint Cyril of Alexandria, had a very different idea of the first men. According to him, Seth, Enos, and all his descendants until Noah led such a holy life, were so similar to God in their virtues that their pious contemporaries called them gods themselves. Hence, in their children, the name children of God or of the gods. And, in fact, the corresponding phrase in the original text can mean either children of God or children of the gods. Enos, having lived 90 years according to the Hebrew text, or 190 years according to the Septuagint, begat Canaan, who at the age of 70 years according to the first text, or 170 according to the second, begat Mahalaleel. The latter lived 65 years, or otherwise 165 years, until he begat Jared, who, according to both texts, begat Enoch at the age of 162 years. The latter, having lived 65 years or 165 years, begat Methuselah. Enoch walked with God. This expression appeared, to a learned person, to indicate the dignity of priesthood. In any case, as early as the 4th century of the Christian era, in a liturgical collection for the ordination of bishops, one could read, O God, who from the beginning established priests for the salvation of your people, first Abel, Seth, and Enos, and Enoch, and Noah, and Melchizedek, and Job. Not only did Enoch make himself pleasing to God through a holy life, but with the zeal of a prophet he preached penitence to the sinners of his time, and threatened them with coming judgment. An apostle said of the impious who blasphemed the gospel, Enoch, 7th from Adam, prophesied about them when he said, Behold, the Lord comes with his holy myriads to execute judgment against all men, and to rebuke among them all the impious for all the works of their impiety, and all the harsh words that impious sinners have uttered against him. What is most surprising is that this patriarch, our common ancestor through Noah, is still alive. Through the merit of his faith, says St. Paul, Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death. He was no longer found because God transported him elsewhere. He is presumed to be in a paradise or place of delights, nourishing himself with the fruits of the tree of life. It is generally believed that at the end of the Christian world, he will come as representative of the primitive world, alongside Elijah, representative of the Jewish world, to bear witness to Christ against his mortal enemy. One would have been surprised by the difference between Hebrew and Greek regarding the ages of the patriarchs. The early church fathers, who first noticed it, were equally surprised. What is singular is that this difference only concerns the years before generation, and not the total lifespan. The 100 years that the Greek or Hebrew add or subtract from the father's life before the son's birth, they subtract or add after, such that the total remains the same. In the 17th century of our era, a third text was rediscovered which had remained unknown since the 6th. This is the Samaritan text, or the Hebrew Pentateuch, received by the schismatic Jews carried into captivity by the Assyrian colony, sent in their place to the land of Samaria. According to the comparison that was made, it was found that, for the patriarchs before the flood, the Hebrew sometimes agrees with the Samaritan, sometimes with the Greek. But for the patriarchs after the flood, the Greek and Samaritan generally agree with each other. From this, some scholars have concluded, not without some foundation, that the simplest approach is to follow the Hebrew for the first period, the Samaritan and Greek for the second, given that one would thus almost always have two against one. This would give approximately 1,656 years from the creation of man until the flood, and 11 to 12 centuries from the flood until the calling of Abraham, 3,002 or 300 years until Jesus Christ. How could such diversity have been introduced? This can be understood. Before the discovery of printing, books had to be copied by hand. Today there are printing errors, and back then there were transcription errors, especially for dates, which were not originally written with spoken expressions, but with numerical letters. As in all these languages, there are several letters that look similar. One could easily be taken for another. There was something more for Jewish writings. Since the captivity of the 10 tribes, about 6 centuries before Jesus Christ, they were spread across the earth, transcribed in the original itself, with 2 different types of characters, the ancient Hebrew characters, which are believed to be Samaritan, and the current Chaldean or Hebrew characters. Towards the middle of this period, the Greek version came to further increase the chances of variance. A transcription error would have slipped into one copy and spread to others. Instead of correcting it using more correct copies, a false critic would have made it the basis of a separate correction system. From there could come with time, without any design to deceive, these reflected differences of diverse texts. The fathers of the Church, who compared them with each other, did not want to touch it, so keen were they to faithfully transmit to us what they had received. These chronological variants prove, moreover, that good faith governed the transcription of the texts. The imposture would have been wiser. The agreement of all texts and all versions in important matters is an all the more certain guarantee. After all, this diversity does not concern the sequence or order of generations and events, but only the duration between some of them. Did a certain father live 100 years more or less before or after the birth of his son? The Church leaves us perfectly free on this question of dates. She rejects neither one nor the other computation. She leaves scholars to discuss which text deserves, in this respect, preference, or what means there are to reconcile them. By authorizing, among the Latin versions, that which is known under the name of Vulgate, she implicitly authorizes the abbreviated chronology of the Hebrew, upon which this version was made. But the Greek version of the Septuagint is equally authorized by the apostles, by the councils, and by the fathers who cite it. One may therefore equally follow its longer chronology. And indeed, the Roman Church, in the announcement of the Feast of Christmas in the Martyrology, counts 52 centuries from the creation of the world to the birth of Jesus Christ, while the partisans of the Hebrew chronology ordinarily count only 40. Were these years of the patriarchs truly years like ours? Were they not simply quarters, or rather lunar months? This has been said in books and newspapers, and the learned writers who said it showed supreme pity for the common Christian who believes that the patriarchs' years were actual years. These years must therefore be only lunar months. By this measure, the 930 years, 912, 960, 950, 600, 464, 175, that Scripture says Adam, Seth, Methuselah, Noah, Shem, Heber, and Abraham lived, would be reduced to the more reasonable measure of 77, 76, 80, 79, 50, 39, and 14, with some months more or less. Certainly there is nothing extraordinary in these ages. What is a bit extraordinary is that Abraham is said to have died in a blessed old age, when he only lived 175 lunar months, in total 14 years and 7 months. What's even more extraordinary is that when he heard God promise him, at the age of 100, that in that same year his wife Sarah, who was 90, would give him a son, he began to laugh, as did she, at seeing themselves become father and mother so old. They should have laughed, rather, at becoming father and mother so young, for he was only 8 years and 4 months old, and she was 7.5 years old. What will appear no less amusing is that Enos, Canaan, Mahalaleel, Heber, Peleg, Nahor, who in Hebrew are said to have begotten at the age of 90, 70, 65, 34, 30, 29 years, would have had children at the age of 7.5, 5 years and 10 months, 5 years and 5 months, 2 years and 10 months, and even 2 years and 5 months. And since, at a time when it is agreed that the Hebrew years were similar to ours, the mother of the Maccabees reminds her youngest son that she had nursed him for 3 years. One must conclude that these grave personages, such as we like to imagine the ancient patriarchs, had sons and daughters before they themselves were weaned. That is not all. Adam, who, according to the original text, begat Seth at 130 years, would have begotten him at 10 years and 10 months. But before the birth of Seth, Cain had killed Abel. When he committed this murder, one must suppose Cain to be at least 20 or 30 years old. He would, therefore, have been born 20 or 30 years before Seth, consequently about 10 years, at the very least, before his father. This is what these learned mockers of the common Christian implicitly say. Here's another reflection. It is said that the flood began in Noah's 600th year, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, and ended in the 600th year, on the 27th of the 2nd month. So that would be 1 lunar month, plus 10 days. But during this period, we first see rain falling for 40 days and 40 nights, then the waters covering the earth for 150 days, then these waters beginning to recede until the 27th of the 7th month, when the ark rested on Mount Ararat, then 40 days, after which Noah released the raven, then 3 times 7 days, when he sent out the dove 3 times, then Noah waiting still longer, both to uncover the ark on the first day of the 1st month of year, 601, and finally to leave it on the 27th of the 2nd month. How can all this fit into one moon cycle? I see only one solution, to say that the moons back then were as long as years are now. We have seen 2 justly famous scholars cited in support of this diminished chronology, and these same scholars recognize, along with everyone else, that the years of the patriarchs were what everyone calls years. Moreover, the traditions of all peoples agree with Moses on the long life of the first humans. Of all mortals, Methuselah lived the longest. He died at the age of 969 years, in the same year as the flood. According to Hebrew, the Vulgate and Samaritan texts, he lived 243 years with Adam, 355 with Seth, 300 with Enoch, 600 with Noah, and 100 with his 3 sons. Thus, between Adam, father of the first world, and Noah, father of the second, there is but a single intermediary person. How easy it was for history and primitive religion to pass without alteration from one world to another. Noah, figure of Jesus Christ. At the age of 187 years, Methuselah begat Lamech, who should not be confused with Lamech, descendant of Cain, who was the first to marry 2 women, just as one should not confuse the prophet Enoch with Enoch, son of Cain, who gave his name to the first city Lamech, lived another 56 years with Adam, 168 with Seth, and 123 with Enoch the prophet. He was 182 when he begat a son whom he called Noah, meaning rest or relief, saying, "This one will comfort us in our work, and the labor of our hands, in the land that the Lord has cursed." A prediction that was fulfilled in more than one way. Noah comforted men in their agricultural work by inventing, according to a Hebrew tradition, ploughing instruments. He comforted them by inventing that liquor which gladdens the heart of man. He was a consolation. For humanity, having deserved through his sacrifice that God would no longer curse the earth. In a higher sense, he was like a mediator between God and men. He buried all the ancient crimes in the flood, and brought forth with him a new world. He was the figure of the one who is our true Noah, our true rest, our true consolation, who himself said, "Come to me, you who labor and are burdened, and I will give you relief, and you will find rest for your souls." Noah, the 10th patriarch, was 500 years old when he came to father Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It is through these three heads of families that the new world would be repopulated. At their birth, the old world was leaning towards its ruin. The children of God and the children of men, their alliances, their corruption. What each of us experiences in small measure, humankind experienced on a grand scale, the combat between spirit and flesh, reason and passions. God had made us one, sin has divided us. Since then, there are two men within us, a Cain and an Abel, one carnal, the other spiritual, one earthly, the other heavenly, one of man, the other of God. Often, in his merciful justice, God afflicts the dominating flesh to liberate the enslaved spirit. He strikes the body to save the soul. Thus it is with all humanity. God had made it one. Sin divided it both from God and from itself. Thenceforth, in human society, two societies emerged. One of the good, the other of the wicked. One of the just, the other of sinners. One of the children of God, the other of the children of man. The first represented by Abel, Seth, Enoch, Noah. The second by Cain and his descendants. When the corrupted portion of humankind came to corrupt almost all the rest, God struck the flesh to save the spirit. This contagious part has a very well-known name. To let oneself be corrupted and to corrupt others in turn, said one of the most eloquent and observant writers of pagan antiquity, Tacitus. This is what we call the age or the world. The opposing part is called in Christian language the city of God, the society of the faithful, the church. Social corruption manifested itself in Cain killing his brother. The descendants of the murderer probably willingly imitated the customs of their ancestor, however. It is not said that there were no exceptions. Abel's virtue was reborn in Seth and propagated naturally in his race. However, it is not said that only good people were born there. The other sons and daughters of Adam, with their posterity, belonged to the society of one or the other, depending on whether they listened to the spirit or the flesh, for one must not imagine that the two societies that divide mankind, the church and the world, were or are separated by distance. They will be separated thus in eternity, but in time they are only separated by spirit and heart. In one, God is the Father and Sovereign. In the other, it is man. Those who recognize God's law, interpreted by divine authority, as the rule of their mind and heart, they are, in this respect, children of God, perhaps disobedient and guilty children, in that they do not always execute the word of their Father, in which, however, they believe. Those, on the contrary, who, without denying that God exists, no more than did the serpent who seduced Eve, would not recognize the obligation to submit to his law, or would submit this law to their private interpretation, they, recognizing at bottom no sovereign but themselves, would no longer be children of God, but children of man. Thus one can easily see that it only takes will to pass from one of these societies to the other. From what we have seen, it is likely that this denomination of children of God and children of man began under Enos, grandson of Adam. Corruption was, by all appearances, making disastrous progress 4 generations later, under Enoch, since we see this prophet preaching penitence and threatening sinners with God's judgments. It reached its peak around the year 480% of Noah. Here is what was the main cause. When men who were not of God began to multiply on earth, and daughters were born to them, the children of God, or of gods, in the sense of Saint Cyril, seeing that the daughters of these men were beautiful, took as wives those whom they chose among all the others. This is how corruption crept into the race of divine men, such as Seth and Enoch. Their descendants allied themselves with the corrupt race of the wicked. They chose wives from among them, not for the beauty of the soul, for virtue, but for the perishable beauty of the body. They married them, not to beget children in the fear of God, but to more freely satisfy the unbridled passions of the flesh. The centuries fertile in crimes, said a pagan poet, first corrupted marriages and procreation and the family. It is from this source that ruin has spread over the homeland and the people. Even the pagans, as we see, felt that the salvation of mankind depends principally on the sanctity of the conjugal union. Threats from God. Disbelief of men. At the sight of this degeneration of the race of the righteous, despite his internal and external warnings, the Eternal said, "My spirit shall not remain forever in man," or, according to another reading, "My spirit will not struggle forever in man, because he is flesh, but his days of respite shall be 120 years. The breath of life that God had put in man was not to remain there forever, because man, having become entirely carnal, deserved to be deprived of it. Or rather, the spirit of grace that struggled in man against desire was not to continue this endless struggle. A great blow was about to be struck, which, in destroying the body, would save the soul. 120 years are still given to mankind to avert the terrible catastrophe through penitence. Those who imagine that these words mean that man's life would be reduced to 120 years are mistaken, for even after the flood, we will see patriarchs living for 4 or 5 centuries. It is about the period of grace that is still granted to men. Instead of punishing them immediately, God, always good, begins with threats. He sets a fatal time, but very distant. He wishes they would prevent it through repentance, and that he would not be obliged to carry out the execution. These threats were undoubtedly communicated immediately by Noah to his contemporaries, that is to say, in the same year 120 before the flood. But, as St. Peter informs us, the contemporaries of Noah did not believe them then, 247. What they did before, they continued to do. They ate, they drank, they married women, they married off their daughters, without worrying about the punishment with which they were threatened. Another monstrosity was still visible. There were giants on the earth in those days, and there were perhaps even more after the children of God approached the daughters of men, and they gave birth. These were the mighty ones, these heroes who were from ancient times men of renowned Scripture, says a little further on, "And the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence according to the force of the original word." One can clearly see how these extraordinary men became famous, through lust and tyranny. The Church Fathers noted that, in the primitive order of nature, God did not grant man dominion over man, but only over animals. Thus, before the flood, we see shepherds of flocks, but no rulers of peoples. We see fathers and children, but no kings or subjects, no masters or slaves. In its early childhood, humankind grew under paternal authority alone. The only true sovereign, having the right of life and death, was God. We see, through the example of Cain and his descendant Lamech, that he had not yet given men the right to put any of them to death, even for crime, since he who killed first was to be punished 7 times, and he who killed second was to be punished 77 times. He reserved for himself alone the punishment, even temporal, of murder. At that time, says Bossuet, he was the only king of men, and governed them visibly 250. Under the gentle authority of God and their fathers, the first humans, therefore, appear to have enjoyed common liberty and equality. The degeneration of the good and the multiplication of the wicked brought the first blow to this initial constitution of humanity. Men of prodigious size were born, with even more prodigious pride, who said in their hearts, "Let our strength be the law of justice 251. These were the first tyrants. They completed the corruption of the earth, and brought upon it the punishments of heaven. Job, Solomon, Baruch, and the son of Sirach show them to us as being of great stature, confident in their strength, knowing war, groaning under the waters with their contemporaries, and perishing unrepentant and proud, without asking forgiveness for their crimes 252. The size, strength, insolence, ferocity, and finally the punishment of these human, or rather inhuman monsters, are equally renowned in profane traditions. The Eternal, seeing that, despite his warnings and threats, the malice of men increased instead of diminishing, and that all the thoughts of their hearts were never turned but to evil, repented that he had created man upon the earth, and moved with grief within himself, said, I will exterminate from the face of the earth the man whom I have created. I will exterminate everything, from man to animals, from reptiles to the birds of the sky. For I regret having made them. He who is by essence is always the same, and does not change. God is not, like man, to lie, it is said, nor, like the Son of Man, to change. Embracing in his eternal present the past, present and future of creation, he executes each thing in its time and place. He creates, he destroys, he renews, he makes changes, but without changing himself, either in his being, his intelligence, or his will. Every Christian knows this. But just as when a good father speaks to his little children, his words become childlike with them. Similarly, when God speaks to men, his word becomes human with humans. He will therefore say that he repents, that he is angry, that he feels compassion, that his heart is moved, that he forgets. And in a sense, all this is true, for all that repentance, anger, compassion, forgetfulness can produce of good in man, God operates without feeling any of what might be imperfect in it. A man who repents of having made a work undoes it, if he can, to make it better. What is imperfect in him is that he did not foresee what happened. If he had seen in advance that his work would have such and such defects, and had only allowed them to draw greater good from them later, the destruction and reconstruction of this work would no longer denote a change or imperfection in the worker's design. God made mankind for a very long duration. He made it free. He put it in the hand of its own counsel, and placed before it good and evil. He saw well that this child of the centuries would soil the end of its first age with serious disorders, but he saw at the same time that the terrible punishment of these disorders would be a salutary lesson for the entire duration of its existence. Therefore when, before proceeding with execution, this father tells the child that he repents of having created him, that he is deeply grieved, it was to make him feel the enormity of his crimes. It was to tell him in a more pathetic way, repent then, so that I am not reduced to striking you. Death sentence against all creatures, except Noah and his family. The ark and its dimensions. To increase the terror of his threats, God announces to mankind that he will exterminate from the face of the earth not only them, but also the animals, the reptiles, the birds of heaven. He seems to wish to touch them with compassion at the sight of so many creatures condemned to perish with them, solely because they were born for their service. All this was in vain. All flesh continued to corrupt its way, and to render inevitable the universal chastisement. Noah alone found grace in the eyes of Jehovah, because he was righteous and perfect in the midst of such a perverse generation, and because he walked with God. It was through him that God announced to his contemporaries the frightful catastrophe that was about to befall them. This is why St. Peter calls him the preacher, the herald of justice. Having therefore seen the earth corrupted to excess, God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, because the earth is filled with violence by them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall divide it into small chambers and coat it with bitumen inside and out, and you shall make it thus. Its length shall be 300 cubits, its width 50, and its height 30. You shall make a window in it. For the top of the ark you shall give it a cubit in height. You shall open a door on the side. Finally, you shall divide the whole ark into first, second, and third floors. And behold, I will bring upon the earth the waters of the flood, to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall perish. But I will establish my covenant with you. You shall enter the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you." He also commanded him to bring in with him 7 males and 7 females of all clean animals, 2 males and 2 females of unclean animals, 7 males and 7 females of clean birds, 2 males and 2 females of unclean birds, of reptiles 2 of each species, to preserve their race on earth. Finally, he was to take all things that could be eaten and carry them into the ark, so that they might serve as food for him and for the animals. But was this ark, with the dimensions that Moses gave it, large enough to contain all species of animals, along with their food requirements for a year? Some have doubted it, some have formally denied it, others, going straight to the facts, have calculated the ark's capacity based on the assigned dimensions, as well as the space needed for all known animal species. They used the Egyptian cubit as a basis, whose standards can still be found in Cairo, and which in all likelihood was common to the Hebrews in Moses' time. It measures 20.5 inches in our measurements. By calculating the capacity of Noah's ark on this basis, they found not only enough space for Noah and his family, for all species of animals and all necessary provisions, but also a considerable amount of free space. At what time did Noah receive the command to build the ark? It is commonly assumed that it was 100 years before the flood. We don't really see what this opinion is based on. When giving the order to build, God said, "You shall enter the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you," which naturally suggests that his sons were then married, and consequently already of a certain age. Now, they were born after their father's 500th year, a century before the flood. The order to build the ark must therefore have been given at least 20 or 30 years later. Will it be said that God speaks of their wives by anticipation? This is possible, but nothing proves it. Besides, even if this were certain, nothing could be concluded from it. Moses does indeed say, in concluding Adam's genealogy up to Noah, that the latter, having lived 500 years, begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But he does not say that what he will report in the following chapter happened at the same time. On the contrary, we see that after having presented everything concerning the genealogy in sequence, he focuses on the particular history of the flood, and begins with a time 20 years prior to Shem's birth, namely when God announced that mankind would have only 60 years to prevent the punishment for their crimes. It seems to us, therefore, that this is the most natural way to reconcile these various texts. In Noah's 480th year, God gives the first warning to guilty men, announcing that they have only 120 years left to do penance. 20 years later, Noah successively begat his 3 sons. About 30 years after their birth, 50 years after the first warning, 70 years before the flood, God definitively commands Noah to build the ark. Noah faithfully executed everything that God had commanded him. He began to build this immense vessel that would save the human race. The construction of such a building must have attracted general attention and reminded everyone of previous predictions and threats. Noah undoubtedly added the new threats and predictions that God had just made. People still didn't believe it, but always presuming, without converting on God's patience which they awaited, they ate and drank until the day Noah entered the ark. They did as most people still do today. Everyone knows well that death is not far away, and that one day it will come to surprise them. Yet they live as if they had more years ahead of them than Methuselah. Age and infirmities may warn, but people reassure themselves God, who has supported us for so long, will surely support us longer. This is how Noah's contemporaries thought when the flood unexpectedly took them all away, just as death unexpectedly takes away most of us. Noah enters the ark. After having threatened punishment for so long, having waited so long for repentance, the Eternal finally said to Noah, "Enter into the ark, you and all your family, for I have seen you righteous before me in this generation. In 7 more days I will cause it to rain upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all living creatures that I have made." Noah executed the orders of the Eternal. As soon as the 7th day appeared, he entered the ark with his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, his wife and his sons' 3 wives with him. They, and all wild animals according to their species, and all domestic animals according to their species, and all reptiles according to their species, and all birds and flying creatures according to their species, entered with Noah into the ark, 2 by 2, male and female, of all flesh in which is the breath of life, just as God had commanded Noah. And the Eternal closed the door on him from the outside, the Deluge. It was the 600th year of Noah, the 17th day of the 2nd month, according to the Hebrew calendar, the 27th, according to the Septuagint. On that very day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and the rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and the waters multiplied and lifted the ark so that it rose above the earth. The flood kept increasing and covered everything, so that the ark floated on the waters, and the waters rose so tremendously that all the highest mountains under all the heavens were covered. The waters rose above the summit of these mountains by 15 cubits more. And all flesh that lived on earth was destroyed, birds, wild animals, domestic animals, and all reptiles that crawl on the earth, and all humans. Everything that had the breath of life on the dry part of the globe died, and the flood destroyed all living creatures that were on the earth. From humans to beasts, from reptiles to birds of the sky, everything was destroyed, and only Noah remained along with those who were with him in the ark. And the fountains of the great deep were broken up, it is said, and the floodgates of heaven were opened. We have seen, at the beginning of creation, this abyss or mass of waters enveloping the earth on all sides and holding it as if in dissolution. God gathered part of it in deep cavities, of which our seas are perhaps only an outflow, and he scattered the other part across the expanse of the heavens. When he wanted to put the earth back under the waters, as in the beginning, he broke, it seems, the barriers of the great reservoir. Vast regions sank into it and drove out the imprisoned waves. On the other hand, The vapors spread in the air, having united, forced their floodgates, and poured onto the earth like torrents that rush down from a cataract. The earth and sky were thus shaken and altered. Thus St. Peter tells us, the heavens that were first, and the earth produced from water by the word of God, in short, the world of then, the original world, perished by flood, but the present heavens, as well as the earth, stored up by the same word, are reserved for fire, for the day of judgment, and the perdition of the ungodly. Heaven and earth have thus become different through the flood. As for the earth, it still shows us the marks in these frightful tears that manifest both on its surface and in its interior. There are some who were troubled about God, where he would find enough water to flood the earth. There are even some who wanted to make this an objection against Moses' account. Fools! First measure the depths of this ocean, which appears to be only a gulf of the great abyss. Sound the treasures of snow and ice piled up at the two poles. Calculate the mass of vapors scattered throughout the atmosphere. A modern astronomer has found, by measuring the northern lights, that the vapors that form them rise at least 500 leagues in perpendicular height above us. Combine all this, then. If you still have concerns, come and we will answer you. You do not find enough water to cover the highest mountains, the Alps, the Cordilleras, the Himalayas. Well, behold, the scholars of our days assure us with unanimous voice that these very mountains were originally as if dissolved in the liquid element, and that they were formed in the bosom of a vast ocean. Ask them what they have done with these primitive waters, and take from them all that you will need. That the victims of the flood are not all victims of hell. A more interesting question for Christian hearts is to know what to think about the eternal salvation of those who perished in the flood. Did this terrible catastrophe finally make them look within themselves, or did it destroy them while they were hardened and unrepentant? As for these monsters of luxury and tyranny who abused their strength to corrupt the earth, the son of Sirach tells us, according to the Greek, God did not appease his wrath against the ancient giants who had revolted in the confidence of their strength. These words can equally mean either that God did not forgive their crime for eternity, or that he did not remit their temporal punishment. For those, therefore, their salvation is at least very doubtful. But is it the same for the multitude of their contemporaries and their victims? St. Peter gives us better hope. Jesus Christ, he tells us, having died in the flesh but made alive in the Spirit, went in this Spirit to preach to the spirits who were in prison, who had been unbelieving at one time, when in Noah's time they counted on God's patience, according to another reading, when God's patience waited for them while the ark was being built. The most learned and celebrated interpreters understand by this, in common agreement, that Noah's contemporaries did not at first believe his predictions of the flood, that they always presumed upon God's patience. But when they saw the fulfillment of his predictions, when they saw the sea overflow in fury and the rains fall in torrents, they believed and repented. The flood destroyed their bodies, but saved their souls. They were detained in the prisons of purgatory when Jesus Christ, dead in his flesh on the cross, came in his spirit or in his soul to preach to them, to announce the good news that he was their Saviour, that their punishments were over, and that they would accompany him with the holy patriarchs in his triumphal entry into heaven. Ah! Who would not bless God's great goodness, directing everything to the salvation of souls, and making even the most terrible scourges of his justice serve this end? Who would not place boundless trust in this good Father, seeing that even those who had so long abused his patience, and had converted only at the last extremity, nevertheless did not implore his mercy in vain? St. Peter, who gives us these consoling news about the men who perished in the flood, is himself another Noah. He too steers a boat a vessel that holds the hope of mankind. This boat is the universal church. It carries in its bosom not just 8 people, but in a sense, all the peoples of the earth. Built slowly, and since the beginning of the world by the patriarchs and prophets, completed by Christ and his apostles in the fullness of time, it has been sailing for 18 centuries on the ocean of human affairs. Alongside it, the old world, the Roman world, will perish in a flood of barbarian nations. The Church, floating above this terrible inundation, will bring forth from it a new world. All that does not receive from it a certain abundance of intellectual and moral life will gradually die. Witness Africa and Asia, represented, if you will, by the unreasonable population of the Diluvian ark. Europe and America, on the contrary, receiving from it a more direct influence, will be the intelligent and sovereign portion of the universe. This is what the Church will do for the temporal salvation of peoples and humanity in general. As for the eternal salvation of individuals, it is an ark that is always open. One enters it through humility of heart. One only definitively leaves it through stubborn pride of mind. Therefore, he who, distrusting himself, is sincerely disposed to submit to the authority that God has established on earth to guide us to heaven, is Catholic at heart, even if not in name. But God alone can know where such souls are, and how many there are. The visible sign that incorporates one into the Church is baptism, symbolized by the flood, because it erases all previous sins and makes man a new man. Yet this sign can be supplemented by desire. Therefore, those who have received baptism, no matter where or by whom, or those who, unable to receive it, have had a genuine desire for it, all these people, as long as they do not embrace error knowingly and with stubbornness of mind, are and remain Catholic, even if they give themselves a different name. God alone knows their number, but this number is certainly very large, for besides adults who, in heretical countries, either because of their ignorance, because of their humility of heart, do not adhere to error with stubbornness, it also includes all children who, in these same countries, have received baptism and have not yet reached the full use of their reason, which amounts to at least half of the total population. When it is said, outside the Catholic Church, there is no salvation, it is as if one were saying, there is no salvation for the proud, but only for the humble. For those who have true humility distrust their own understanding, feel the need for a divinely established authority to guide us in the way of salvation, ask only to know it and submit to it. Now, by this very fact they are Catholic in heart, they are in the Church. They may be there without knowing it, as certain creatures, without knowing why or how, were enclosed and saved in Noah's ark. But still, as outside that ark no one was saved from temporal death, likewise, outside the Church, no one will be saved from eternal death. This is the unanimous voice of all Christian centuries. What happiness for the Catholic, not only to be in this new ark, but to know it. He has the noble pleasure of facing the storm, and the certainty of not being submerged by it. He sees, in passing, thrones and empires collapsing under the same waves that raise the Church to heaven. All those who are not with him in Peter's boat, he sees them floating here and there, at every wind of doctrine, on a shoreless ocean. His only desire is to extend a helping hand to save them from eternal shipwreck, happier in this respect than Noah and his sons, for it was not given to them to save from temporal death those whom they knew were struggling against the waters of the flood. These vengeful waters had risen 15 cubits, about 25 feet, above the highest mountains. They remained in this state for 150 days. Toward the end of this time, God, remembering Noah and all that was with him in the ark, caused a wind to blow over the earth, and the waters ceased to rise. The fountains of the deep were closed, as well as the floodgates of heaven. The waters, coming and going, withdrew from the earth, such that on the 2007th day of the 7th month, the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat or Armenia. They continued to decrease until the 10th month, when, on the first day of the month, the mountain tops appeared. 40 days later, Noah opened the window of the ark and sent out a raven that did not return inside, but it seems fed on corpses and came back to perch on the roof of the ark until the waters had completely disappeared from the earth. 7 days later, he sent out a dove, but it, having found no place to set its foot, as the mountains were still covered with mud and the rest under water, returned to him, and Noah, stretching out his hand, took it and put it back in the ark. He waited another 7 days and sent out the dove again. It returned to him in the evening, carrying in its beak an olive branch with green leaves. Noah understood then that the waters had receded from the face of the earth. After another 7 days, he sent out the dove for the 3rd time, but it did not return, having found the earth dry and habitable. Finally, in the 601st year of his life, on the 1st day of the 1st month, Noah, opening the roof of the ark, saw that the surface of the earth was dried. However, he did not yet leave. He waited for God to give him the order, which happened on the 27th day of the 2nd month. God said to him, "Come out of the ark, you and your wife, your sons and your sons' wives with you, and all the animals that are with you, of all flesh, both birds and livestock and creeping things, bring them with you, and enter upon the earth. Increase and multiply there." Noah carried out this order the same day. Coming out of the ark on the 27th of the 2nd month, after having entered it on the 17th of the same month the previous year, we can see that he stayed there for a year and 11 days, including the 1st and last days. Assuming, as some presume, that this year was a lunar year of 354 days in any case, by adding the 11 days, we get 365 days, therefore a true solar year. The second father of mankind then gave to the new world, which was beginning, the example of what is to be done above all. The first thing he did upon leaving the ark and taking possession of the earth again was to build an altar to the one who is, to the eternal. Then, taking from all the clean animals and all the clean birds, he offered them as a burnt offering on this altar. Here we see why, even before the flood, animals were distinguished as clean and unclean. It is because the former could be offered to God as sacrifice, and according to ancient custom, their flesh could be shared among those present. This was not the case for the others. The Eternal accepted the sacrifice of our second ancestor, and said in his heart, "I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the thoughts of the human heart are inclined to evil from youth. Therefore I will never again strike down all living creatures as I have done," this terrible example being sufficient forever. Thus, as long as the earth endures, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. This suggests that, during the flood, all of this was in chaos. Blessing of man. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Let all land animals, all birds of the sky, everything that moves on the earth, and all fish of the sea fear and dread you. All these creatures are placed in your hands. You may take for your food everything that moves and lives. I give you everything as I gave you the green plants. You shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For I will require your blood, in which is your life, from every animal, and from man, whether brother or stranger. I will require the life of man from anyone. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for man was made in God's image. But you, Be fruitful and multiply, and go forth upon the earth and fill it. Not only does God no longer curse the earth because of men, but he blesses the men who must repopulate it. He blesses Noah and his sons. He blesses them, and in them all of mankind, and in them ourselves. One might have thought that he had taken away our dominion over animals. He confirms it to us. In truth, it will no longer be as easy or as absolute as it was for Adam, however. It still exists, and our mere gaze instills terror in most of these creatures. What am I saying? Far from restricting our empire over them, God seems to increase it. He delivers them into our hands without reserve. We can eat their flesh indiscriminately. This suggests that before the flood, this permission was not as explicit or as general. Perhaps it was limited to the flesh of sacrificial victims. Only one restriction is placed, which is not to eat there. Blood. This prohibition surprises us today. Back then, it was of the utmost importance. One of the causes that led to the flood appears to have been ferocity and murder. To turn the new men away from this, God takes all means to inspire horror of blood. He foresaw, even then, that one day brutish peoples, after becoming accustomed to drinking the blood of animals taken in hunting, would end up drinking the blood of men taken in war. This is why this defense exists. This is why he so formally announces that he will avenge the blood of man even upon the beast, as indeed he will command in his law given to the Hebrews to stone the ox that has injured or killed someone. He will avenge the blood of man upon man himself. He had already done so. He had already avenged Abel's blood upon Cain, but nevertheless sparing the guilty one's life. Here the punishment becomes more severe. Whoever sheds the blood of man, his blood shall be shed. And the reason for this law is that man is made in God's image. Right of life and death given to society. Here we can see the natural constitution of human society taking shape. God, the sole master of taking life, because he alone gives it, establishes this capital law. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. He does not say that he reserves its execution for himself. He no longer says that whoever kills the murderer will be punished sevenfold. But whom does he then charge with enforcing this law? Undoubtedly those to whom he notifies it, Noah and his 3 sons, who were then all of mankind, all heads of families, presided over by the Father of all. He commanded each of them, Scripture tells us, to take care of their neighbor consequently, to watch over the safety of their lives, and to pursue the murderer. But who will judge the fact? Who will apply the punishment? Naturally those who received the law and are its depositaries, men, heads of families united under the leadership of their chief. Thus we will see Noah, upon the testimony of his sons, pronouncing a sentence of curse and servitude against one of his descendants. Later, in the absence of a common ancestor, when the heads of families, the patriarchs of a city or tribe, either voluntarily or driven by circumstances, would confer or recognize in one of them this duty and right to pronounce on the freedom and life of criminals, this would become, as they said then in Palestine, the Father King, or Abimelech, one of the first royal titles we will see appear. Such seems to us the origin and natural development of the right of life and death, or of sovereignty properly speaking, which God appears to have communicated to men only after the flood. Be it so that God alone is the principal sovereign, and that others are but his responsible ministers. Furthermore, from the origin of the first world we see a priest and a sacrifice, but of king and tribute we see neither at the beginning nor at the end. In the new world, the patriarch through whom God saved it appears first as universal pontiff, to build an altar to the Most High, to offer him a sacrifice in the name of all humanity. Behold his first action. Religion, priesthood, the churches of all times, temporal sovereignty, the right of life and death came only late. as an unfortunate remedy against greater evils. God said again to Noah and his sons with him, Behold, I establish my covenant with you, and with your descendants after you, and with all living creatures that were with you in thee. Ark, the birds, domestic animals, and others of every kind. I therefore establish this covenant with you. Henceforth all flesh shall no longer be destroyed by the waters of the flood, and there shall be no more flood to destroy the earth. And this is what I give you, as a sign of the covenant between you and me, and all living creatures that were with you, for generations forever I will place. Otherwise I have placed my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of covenant between me and the earth. And, when I cover the sky with clouds, my bow shall appear, and I will remember my covenant with you and with every living creature. And the waters of the flood shall no more return to destroy all flesh. My bow shall therefore be in the clouds, and I will see it to remember the everlasting covenant that is established between God and all living creatures on earth. Assurances against a new flood. Not only did God bless Noah and his sons, but he made a covenant with them and with their posterity, that is, with us. He reassures them. He reassures us forever against the return of a universal flood. He extends his goodness even to the brute, because it is connected to man and is made for him. He places no condition on this covenant, so as to leave us without doubt. Not content with giving us his word, he adds a visible pledge. The rainbow, with the gentle nuances of its 7 colors, will remind him, or rather will remind us, of this eternal covenant of his mercy. Whether this divine ark appeared then for the first time, and the sky, previously without image, had begun to be adorned with vapors furnished by the waters of the flood, or whether it had already been seen and God merely made of it a new signal of his clemency, still it is like a sacrament of his covenant and his promise. He even seems to cherish this celestial symbol. When, in the Apocalypse, his throne is set up, the iris forms a circle around his feet and displays principally the gentlest of colors, which is an emerald green. It was something similar that appeared to the 70 elders of Israel, and when he showed himself to them in the throne of his glory, a sapphire color was seen at his feet, as when the sky is serene. The mysterious significance of this marvelous ark was not unknown to ancient peoples. Everywhere it was regarded as a sign of divinity, and as a path of communication between heaven and earth. Noah, which means rest or consolation, the ark that he built, the flood he enters and exits, the dove with its olive branch, announcing heaven's peace, the sacrifice he offers, the satisfaction with which God accepts it, the blessing he spreads upon him, and all his race, the eternal alliance he forms with him and with them. All this was fulfilled even more truly in Christ. He is the true Noah. Our true consolation and rest. He built another ark, his church, to transport us from eternal death to eternal life. He entered the waters of Jordan with the guilty world, and emerged with the regenerated world. The Spirit of holiness and grace descends upon him in the form of a dove, and a voice is heard from heaven. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. He offers a sacrifice of infinite worth. He offers himself and us with him. God reconciles with us through him, fills us with his blessings through him, loves us through him with ineffable love, and adopts us as his children forever. The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These are the 3 sons of Noah, and from them descended all the human race that spread across the earth. Shem, the eldest of the 3, without leaving the country that was like the cradle of humankind, spread eastward. From him came the Hebrews, the Assyrians, the Persians, and other more eastern nations. The best Persian historians say that their first king was the son of Shem. Even today, at the foot of the Himalayan mountains in India, There exists a very ancient city called Bamiyan and also Sembamian, which many Hindus attribute its founding to Shem. Ham shared Africa and a part of Asia. Egypt is called the land of Ham in the Psalms, and Chemia in Plutarch. All of Africa is called Ammonia by ancient authors. The Egyptians are still called Mizraim, from the name of one of Ham's sons. Another of his sons, Canaan, populated the country that bears his name. Sidon, son of Canaan, was the father of the Sidonians. Japhet, so famous in secular authors under the name Iapet, populated the west and the north. From him descended the Tartars, the Scythians, the Cimbri, the Romans, the Gauls, the Ionians, or ancient Greeks. These people had a saying, older than Japhet, to speak of something so ancient that its origin was barely known. Noah plants the vineyard. In a memorable occasion, Noah made known to his 3 sons what would happen to their posterity. Being a farmer after the flood, as he had undoubtedly been before, he began to till the earth and planted a vineyard, not only to eat the grapes, as had been done until then, but to extract the juice and make a drink. Having thus drunk wine whose strength he did not know, he became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. Ham, father of Canaan, finding him in this state, went outside and mockingly told his 2 brothers. But Shem and Japheth, instead of imitating him by mocking their father, spread a cloak over their shoulders and, walking backwards, covered what needed to be hidden in their father. When Noah awoke from this wine-induced stupor and learned how his youngest son had treated him, he said to punish him, "Cursed be Canaan. Let him be, with respect to his brothers, the slave of slaves." He added, "Blessed be Jehovah, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God extend Japheth's possessions, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem. And let Canaan be his slave, 272. Shem and Japheth are blessed, but not Ham. However, the latter is not cursed, perhaps because he had been blessed by God. His son, Canaan, is cursed in his place. It is possible that he was the first to see his grandfather's nakedness, and mocked him with his father. This is, among others, the opinion of the Hebrews. As for Shem, he receives a higher blessing than Japheth. The Eternal is called the God of Shem. Thus it is in the race of Shem, among the eastern nations, that the religion of the true God is preserved longer and purer. We will see there, among others, the exemplary penitence of the great city of Nineveh. It is from the race of Shem that God chooses his particular people. It is from the race of Shem that the Saviour of the world will be born. Japheth, whose name means extension, indeed extended prodigiously through his posterity. From him came these conquering peoples, the Tartars, the Scythians, the Celts, the Greeks, the Romans, the modern Europeans, who have carried and still carry their dominion throughout the earth, in Asia, in Africa, and in America, and who currently reign from China to England, and from England to China. But above all they dwell in the tents of Shem, in the churches founded by Jesus Christ and his apostles, descendants of Shem. Ham's descendants, Egypt and Africa, are deprived of both blessings. Idolatry appears there earlier, and in cruder forms, invaded and subjugated in turn by the Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the Arabs. Similar to Canaan, all descendants of Ham seem to have long been condemned to slavery. One might say they themselves are tasked with carrying out the sentence. The main commerce of the inhabitants of a large part of Africa is to sell each other as slaves to the descendants of Japheth, to Europeans. The latter, more receptive to humanity and true religion, will cease to buy, but when will the former cease to sell themselves or kill each other? Memory of the flood among various peoples. The story of Noah and the flood is found, more or less altered, in all traditions. It is encountered even where one least expects it. For example, when America was discovered 3 centuries ago, the tradition of the universal flood was found there. The Mexicans, according to a respected historian of this new world, had, like all other civilized nations, a distinct knowledge, although mixed with fables, of the creation of the world, the flood, the confusion of languages, and the dispersion of peoples. They even represented all these events through paintings. All men, they said, had been drowned in a general flood. Only one man, whom they called Coxcox, others Teocipactli, had saved himself in a boat with his wife, Xochiquetzal. They landed on a mountain, which they called Colhuacan, and produced a large number of children, who remained mute until a dove, from the top of a tree, taught them languages, but they were so different that no one could understand the other. Several historians of America, he says, report that the inhabitants of Cuba, when questioned by the Spanish about their origin, gave the following information. They had heard from their ancestors that God had created heaven, earth, and all things. Furthermore, an old man, foreseeing the flood by which God would punish men for their sins, had built a large boat, and embarked on it with his family, and many animals. When the flood subsided, he sent out a raven, which, finding many dead bodies, did not return shortly after. He released a dove, which quickly returned with a hoba branch in its beak. The old man, having judged that the earth was dry, left the vessel, made wine from wild grapes, got drunk, and fell asleep. One of his sons mocked his nakedness, which another respectfully covered. Upon awakening, he blessed the latter and cursed the former. They said they were descendants of the latter, and that was why they went naked, while the Spanish well-dressed, perhaps descended from the other. The author we cite is all the more trustworthy. As he himself was born in Mexico, he traveled through the country in all directions for more than 30 years, collecting various traditions and hieroglyphic paintings. What brings certainty to its highest degree is that in our time, a famous scholar, having traveled and studied the same country, found the same paintings and traditions there. Explaining in one place the hieroglyphic history of the Aztecs, from the flood until the foundation of the city of Mexico, here is how he expresses himself on the first of these events. The story begins with the flood of Coxcox. Among the different peoples who inhabit Mexico, paintings representing this flood have been found among the Aztecs, the Mixtecs, the Zapotecs, the Tlaxcaltecs, and the Michoacanese. The Noah of these peoples is called Coxcox, Tespi, or Teocipactli. He saved himself, along with his wife, Xochiquetzal, in a boat, or, according to others, on a raft. The painting shows Coxcox in the middle of the water, lying in a boat. The mountain, whose summit crowned with a tree rises above the waters, is the Mexican Ararat. At the foot of the mountain appear the heads of Coxcox and his wife. The men born after the flood were mute. A dove, from the top of a tree, distributes languages to them represented in the form of small commas. This dove should not be confused with the bird that brings Coxcox news that the waters have receded. The people of Michoacan preserved a tradition according to which Coxcox, whom they call Tespi, embarked in a spacious acali with his wife, his children, several animals, and seeds whose preservation was dear to mankind. When the Great Spirit ordered the waters to withdraw, Tespi released a vulture from his boat. The bird that feeds on dead flesh did not return because of the large number of corpses that littered the recently dried earth. Tespi sent other birds, among which only the hummingbird returned, holding in its beak a branch covered with leaves. Then Tespi, seeing that the ground was beginning to be covered with new greenery, left his boat near the mountain of Colhuacan. A remarkable similarity in traditions, hieroglyphics, architectural monuments, political institutions, and even languages, has convinced modern scholars that America was originally populated by migrations from Asia, or that at least there were ancient communications between these two parts of the earth. After having thus found in America the last colony of humankind, let us consult its metropolis in Central Asia. But before arriving there from the New World, a great people presents itself. China, which has formed a vast monarchy for 2.5 centuries before the Christian era, but which previously was divided into several small kingdoms, offers us in its fabulous chronicle a character who bears more than one similarity to Noah. This is Fohi, its first king or emperor. It is said that Fohi had no father, meaning that Noah was the first man on earth after the flood. His ancestors belonged to a previous world, and as their memory had not been preserved in Chinese traditions, Noah or Fohi was considered to have had no father at all. Fohi's mother conceived him while surrounded by a rainbow, an imagination which, in all likelihood, came from the fact that Noah was the first to perceive the rainbow, and from the Chinese wishing to say something about his origin. Fohi carefully raised animals of 7 different species, which he was accustomed to sacrifice to the sovereign spirit of heaven and earth. And Moses tells us that Noah took with him into the ark 7 pairs of each species of clean animals, and that after the flood he offered holocausts to the Eternal. The wife, or according to others, the sister of Fohi, was called Nuva, or Nuhi, the sovereign of virgins, and Homu, the sovereign mother. The name Nuhi or Nuva bears no small resemblance to that of Noah or Nu, as pronounced by Orientals. In the time of Fohi and Nuva, Kongkong caused the flood, writes Vensei 277. Kongkong, says Lopai, was the first of rebels. He incited the flood to make the universe wretched. He broke the bonds that united heaven and earth, and men, overwhelmed by miseries, could not bear them. Then Nuva, deploying her entirely divine powers, fought Kongkong, defeated him completely, and drove him away. After this victory, she re-established the 4 cardinal points and restored peace to the world. In the Shouqing, a kind of historical moral treatise for the use of kings, the philosopher Confucius shows us the first emperor of China of whom he speaks, Yao, occupied with draining away the waters which, having risen to the heavens, still bathed the foot of the highest mountains, covered the less elevated hills, and made the plains impracticable. Even more singular peculiarities are noted in ancient Chinese writing. The figure of water with that of the mouth and the sign of 8 means great inundation, a mouth, a vessel, and 8. Successful navigation, water and vessel under a triangle, signifies favor, deliverance, escape from peril, mouth, man and food, with the sign of 8, ancient sacrifice, about which nothing more precise is known. The sign 2, often also 8 with the image of descendants, is called posterity. The sign 8 with the figure of the mouth, to choose, to divide. Finally, according to Chinese history, Fohi established himself in the province of Chensi, which is in the northwest of China, toward India and Mount Ararat, where Noah's Ark came to rest, which indicates to us the route to follow to find more certain information. Meanwhile, the vainglorious Chinese, with all his respect for ancestors, has preserved the memory of the most famous ancestor less well than the ignorant American. India, being closer to the places where Noah's first descendants must have initially settled, will naturally offer us something more complete, but the imagination of the Hindus, even more fertile and bold than that of the Greeks, will intermingle it with poetic marvels that are hardly familiar in Europe. Thus, in one of the sacred poems of Hindustan, we read, desiring the preservation of flocks and Brahmins, spirits and virtuous men, the Vedas, law, and precious things. The Lord of the universe takes several bodily forms, but although, like air, he passes through a multitude of beings, he always remains himself, because he has no quality subject to change. At the end of the last Kalpa, there was a general destruction caused by Brahma's sleep. His creatures from different worlds were drowned in a vast ocean. Brahma wanting to sleep, and wishing for rest after a long succession of ages, the strong demon Hayagriva approached him and stole the Vedas that had flowed from his lips. When Hari, the preserver of the universe, discovered this action by the prince of Danavas, he took the form of a small fish called Safari. A holy monarch named Satyavrata reigned then. He was a servant of the spirit that hovered over the waters, and so pious that water was his only nourishment. He was the son of the sun, and, in the current Kalpa, he is invested by Narayan with the office of Manu, under the name of Sradadeva, or god of funerals. One day, when he was making a libation in the river Kritamala, and was holding water in the palm of his hand, he saw a small fish moving in it. The king of Dravira immediately threw the fish and water back into the river where he had taken them. Then the Safari spoke these words pathetically to the benevolent monarch. "O king who shows compassion for the oppressed, how can you leave me in the water of this river, me being too weak to resist the monsters that inhabit it and fill me with terror?" The prince, not knowing who had taken the form of a fish, focused his mind on preserving the Safari, both out of natural kindness and for the salvation of his soul. And, after hearing its prayer, he kindly placed it under his protection, in a small vessel filled with water. But, in the space of a single night, it grew so much that the vessel could no longer contain it. It spoke these words to the illustrious prince. "I do not like to live miserably in this small vessel. Provide me with a dwelling where I can live with pleasure." The king, removing it from the vase, placed it in a cistern, but it grew to 50 cubits in less than 50 minutes, and said, "O king, I do not wish to remain uselessly in this narrow cistern. Since you have granted me asylum, give me a spacious dwelling." The king changed its location and put it in a pond, where, having enough space around its body, it grew to a prodigious size. "O monarch," it said again, "this dwelling is not comfortable for me, who must swim at large in the waters, work for my safety, and transport me to a deep lake." At these words, the pious monarch threw the supplicant into a lake, and when its size equalled the extent of this body of water, he threw the enormous fish into the sea. When it was amid the waves, it spoke thus to Satyavrata, "Here, horned gluttons and other very strong monsters will devour me, O valiant man. You will not leave me in this ocean." Thus deceived repeatedly by the fish who had addressed him with flattering words, the king said, "Who are you, who deceives me under this borrowed form? Never before you have I seen or heard of such a prodigious water inhabitant, who like you has filled a lake of 100 leagues circumference in a single day. Surely you are Bhagavat who appears to me, the great Hairy, whose dwelling was on the waves, and who now takes the form of the inhabitants of the abyss. Greetings and praise to you, O first male, Lord of creation, preservation and destruction. You are, O supreme governor, the most sublime object we have in view. We, your worshippers, who piously seek you. All your illusory descents into this world give existence to different beings, but I am curious to know for what reason you have borrowed this form. O you with lotus eyes, may I not approach in vain the feet of a God whose perfect beneficence has extended to all, when you have shown us, to our great surprise, the appearance of other bodies, not actually existing, but presented successively, the Lord of the universe, loving the pious man who implored him thus, and desiring to preserve him from the sea of destruction caused by the perversity of the age, told him in these terms what he had to do, O you who subdues enemies. In 7 days the 3 worlds will be plunged into an ocean of death, but amid the murderous waves a great vessel, sent by me for your use, will appear before you. You will then take all medicinal plants, the whole multitude of seeds, and accompanied by 7 saints, surrounded by pairs of all animals, you will enter this spacious ark, and you will stay there sheltered from the flood of an immense ocean, with no other light than the splendor of your holy companions. Pulling the vessel, with you and your companions, I will remain on the ocean, O leader of men, until the night of Brahma has completely elapsed. You will then know my true greatness, rightly called the Supreme Divinity. Through my favor, all your questions will be answered, and your spirit will receive instructions in abundance. Heri disappeared after giving these orders to the monarch, and Satyavrata waited humbly for the time assigned by the one who rules our senses. The pious monarch, having spread the pointed stalks of darbha grass toward the east, and turned his face to the north, sat meditating on the feet of the god who had taken the form of a Ephish. The sea, crossing its shores, flooded all the earth, and soon was increased by rains poured from immense clouds. The king, still meditating on Bhagavat's commandments, saw the vessel approach and entered it with the chiefs of the Brahmins, after having brought medicinal plants and following Heri's precepts. The saints addressed him thus, O king, meditate on Sesava, who will surely deliver us from this danger and grant us prosperity. The god, invoked by the monarch, appeared again distinctly on the vast ocean, in the form of a gold-bright fish, extending 1,000,000 leagues with an enormous horn to which the king, as Heri had commanded him, tied the vessel with a cable made of a great serpent, and, happy with his preservation, stood praising the destroyer of Madhu. When the monarch had finished his hymn, the first male, Bhagavat, who watched over his safety on the great expanse of waters, spoke aloud to his own divine essence, pronouncing a sacred Purana, which contained the rules of Sankhya philosophy. But it was an infinite mystery that was to be hidden in Satyavrata's breast. Seated in the vessel with the saints, he heard the principle of the soul, the eternal being, proclaimed by the supreme power. Then Heri, rising with Brahma from the destructive air flood, which was calmed, killed the demon Hayagriva, and recovered the sacred books. Satyavrata, instructed in all divine and human knowledge, was chosen, in the current Kalpa, by Vishnu's favor as the 7th Manu, and surnamed Vaivasvata. But the appearance of a horned fish to the religious monarch was Maya, and he who will devoutly hear this historical and allegorical account will be freed from the bondage of sin. These last words warn us of what we may have already noticed, that there are both allegories and history in this story. Indeed, what do this sleep of Brahma, this theft of sacred books by the demon mean in simpler terms? If not that all flesh had corrupted its way, that God's commandments were forgotten, and that the main author of this evil was the leader of wicked spirits. But also, how can one not recognize the story of Noah in Satyavrata or Manu, who is warned by the divinity that in 7 days a universal flood will begin, and who saves himself in a spacious ark with 7 other holy figures and pairs of all animals? This pious monarch is named the god of funerals, undoubtedly because he survived everyone from the previous world. Narayan, or the Spirit of God, whom the Indians represent as hovering over the waters at creation, established him as Manu, legislator and patriarch in the current age of the world. It is to Manu that the Indians attribute the ancient laws that govern them. It is to Noah, as we have seen, that God gave the fundamental laws of human society. The name Manu alone seems to prove the identity of the 2 characters. Me is the Indian article. Nu is the Oriental name for Noah. The Arabs call him Nu al-Nabi, Noah the prophet. Some scholars have even believed they recognized him in the Minos of the Greeks and the Manus of the Germans. Other accounts add different circumstances to the same foundation. We believe it unnecessary to report them. But it is impossible for us not to cite a remarkable passage found in one of the books that, from time immemorial, the Hindus regard as a revelation from Vishnu, and which was translated by one of the most learned men of the last century, the founder of the Calcutta Academy. Satyavrata, king of all the earth, had 3 sons, the eldest Surma, then Chama, and the third Yapeti. They were wise men, excellent in virtue and noble actions, skilled in handling all kinds of weapons, valiant and eager for victories. Satyavrata, who delighted in spiritual contemplation, seeing that his sons were fit for government, put them in charge. When one day, by decree of fate, the king had drunk must, he lost his senses and fell asleep. Chama, noticing this, called his brothers and said, "What is this? In what state is our father?" They covered him with clothes and brought him back to his senses. When he came to himself and fully understood what had happened, he cursed Chama. "You shall be the slave of slaves. And because you were a mocker in their presence, you shall take your name from mockery." Then he gave Surma vast sovereignty to the south of the snow mountains, and to Yapeti he gave everything north of these mountains. As for himself, he attained, through his pious contemplation, the highest felicity. There is no need for commentary here. Who does not recognize Sem or scheme in Surma, Cham in Chama, Japheth in Yapeti? In the first 2 names, only one inserted letter makes any difference. The final is only an Indian termination. The third is absolutely identical, for, in Hebrew itself, with the same letters, one can pronounce either Yaphet or Yapet. The division of lands could not be more exact. The posterity of Shem extended principally in southern Asia, that of Japheth, in northern Asia and in Europe. Famous scholars have believed they recognized Noah in the fabulous Kronos, or Saturn of the Greeks and Romans. Homer and Plato say that Kronos and his wife, with all their posterity, were born from the ocean. Noah and his wife, with all their posterity, emerged from the efflood. In Orpheus's hymns, Kronos and his wife are called the father and mother of all mortals and immortals. Noah and his wife are the same, both of those who still face death and those who have already achieved immortality. Noah was a righteous man amid a perverse generation he tried to bring back to good. Kronos was a just king amid a savage generation he tried to civilize. After the flood, Noah ruled for some time, as father over all mankind. The earth, not yet divided by inheritance, belonged entirely to all. There were no slaves yet. The same is said of Saturn's reign. In Noah's time, all the earth had one language. In Saturn's time, even animals, according to fable, spoke the same language as humans. Saturn has the earth, or Thea, as his wife. In the Hebrew text, Noah is literally called the man or husband of the earth, meaning farmer, while Cain is called its servant or slave. Noah was the first in the New World to cultivate the earth and plant a vine. Saturn is said to have been the first to teach agriculture and the use of wine. On ancient Roman coins, Saturn's symbol was a ship. Noah's symbol is the ark. Saturn is said to have devoured all his children, except for 3 sons who shared the globe. Noah, prophet and patriarch of the previous world, is said to have condemned it to perish because he predicted its destruction. He saved only 3 sons who shared the globe. One of these 3 saw him in an indecent state and mocked him. One of Saturn's 3 sons saw him in a similar state, since he mutilated him. Noah's son was called Ham, and became the father of Africans. Saturn's son was called Hammon or Ammon in Egypt and Africa. Indeed, these are rather remarkable connections worthy of attention. If, moreover, the descendants of Ham do not offer us a history of the flood, as explicit and detailed as the descendants of Shem, here perhaps is the reason. This history did not do much honor to their ancestor. Nevertheless, the belief in a universal flood was so well established among the Egyptians that their priests told Solon that after certain periods of time, a flood sent from heaven changed the face of the earth, that humankind had perished several times in different ways, and that it was for this reason that the new race of men lacked monuments and knowledge of past times. As for the Chaldeans and Assyrians, many celebrated authors of antiquity show us that the story of the flood was not forgotten among them. The one from whom we have the most substantial fragments is Berosus, a famous Chaldean astronomer who wrote a history of the kingdom of Babylon about 3 centuries before Jesus Christ. He is cited by Pliny, Vitruvius, Tatian, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Eusebius. He provides a sequence of 10 kings whom he supposes to have reigned in Babylon before the flood, as the number of these kings corresponds exactly to the 10 generations that passed from creation. Until the flood, the first king, named Allorus, appears to have been the same as Adam, just as Zisithrus, the last one, seems to have been Noah. Allorus declared that God himself had made him shepherd of the people, and, to tell the truth, if any man could claim that his dominion was of divine institution, it must have been Adam. During the reign of Zisithrus, the 10th king or patriarch, there was a flood of which Berosus relates the following circumstances. Kronos, or Saturn, appeared to Zisithrus in a dream, and warned him that on the 15th day of the month of Esius, humankind would be destroyed by the flood. He ordered him to set aside the origin, history, and end of all things, and to bury these writings in Sippara, the city of the sun. He further ordered him to build a vessel, and to enter it with his relatives and friends, after having put in the necessary provisions, and having brought in birds and quadrupeds, and when he had provided everything, if anyone asked him where he was going with his vessel, to answer, towards the gods, to pray for them to make humankind happy. Zisithrus executed his orders and built a vessel whose length was 5 stades and width was 2 stades. He brought aboard the ship all that had been prescribed to him, and entered it with his wife, his children, and his friends. When the deluge came, and shortly thereafter ceased, Zisithrus released certain birds which, finding neither food nor place to rest, returned to the ship. Some days later, Zisithrus again released birds that returned with a little mud on their feet. But when for the 3rd time he permitted them to fly away, he saw them no more, which made him understand that the earth was beginning to dry. He then made an opening in one of the sides of the vessel, and saw by this means that it had come to rest upon a mountain. He departed from it with his wife, his daughter, and the pilot of the ship. Then, having worshipped the earth, erected an altar and sacrificed to the gods. He and those who had accompanied him disappeared. Those who had remained in the vessel, seeing that Zisithrus, his wife, his daughter, and the pilot did not return, disembarked to search for them, calling out loudly, but they never saw them again. A voice that came from the air commanded them to be religious. It informed them that the piety of Zisithrus had caused him to be transported to the dwelling place of the gods, and that those who had accompanied him inhabited the same abode. It instructed them to go to Babylon, to take the writings that were at Sippara, and to share them with humankind. Finally, the voice told them they would find Sippara and the writings of Zisithrus in the country of Armenia. When the voice ceased speaking, they offered sacrifices to the gods, and took together the road to Babylon. When they arrived there, they unearthed the writings previously mentioned, constructed several cities, erected temples, and rebuilt Babylon. Abydos, in his History of Assyria, and Alexander, nicknamed Polyhester due to his vast erudition, spoke like Berosus and cited him. The latter added, among other things, it is said that remains of this ship can still be seen on the mountain of the Chaldeans in Armenia, and some people bring back pieces of bitumen that coated it from this place, using them as a preservative. Hieronymus of Egypt, in his Phoenician Antiquities, Manasseh, and several others, according to. Historian Josephus reported the same things. Nicholas of Damascus, famous under Augustus, wrote in the 96th book of his history, "There is in Armenia, in the province of Minyas, a high mountain called Baris, where it is said that many were saved during the cataclysm, and that an ark, whose remains were preserved for a long time, and in which a man had enclosed himself, stopped on this mountain. This is apparently the one Moses the Jewish legislator speaks of. This author, as we can see, was hardly mistaken. Josephus adds that the Armenians called the place where Noah offered his sacrifice the place of descent. This place, which became a city, still exists at the foot of Mount Ararat, and bears the name of Nehichivan, which indeed has that meaning. The Armenians of our time claim, as did those of ancient times, that the ark still exists on the mountain where it stopped. As for the Greeks, and consequently the Romans, here is how Lucian, speaking of a famous temple in Hierapolis in Syria, summarizes their tradition about the flood. The majority say that this temple was built by Deucalion, the Scythian, during whose time the great flood occurred. I've heard in Greece what the Greeks say about this character. Their account is as follows. The current race of humans is not the first, it has entirely perished, but a second generation, descended from Deucalion. The men of this first race were insolent, unjust, perjurers, showing no hospitality towards strangers, without pity for suppliants, which brought upon them a great calamity. All at once there emerged from the earth a prodigious quantity of water. Much rain fell, the rivers overflowed, and the sea rose to a considerable height, so that all became water, and all men were drowned. Only Deucalion was preserved for a new generation, because of his wisdom and piety. He entered a great ark with his sons and their wives. Then he brought in pigs, horses, lions, serpents, and all other creatures that live on earth, all in pairs. He received them all, and they did him no harm, the divinity having formed a great friendship between them and him. Thus they all sailed in one, and the same ark, as long as the waters prevailed. This is what the Greeks relate of Deucalion. Lucian adds that for the Hieropolitans they had an ancient tradition, according to which a great opening had formed in their country, where all the water of the deluge was engulfed. Deucalion built, at the very spot, altars and a temple. Lucian saw this opening, which then was rather narrow. Twice a year they carried sea-water there in memory of what had taken place, and one saw this ceremony practiced not only by priests, but by all Syria, Arabia, and a multitude of men who came for this purpose from as far as the banks of the Euphrates. Deucalion had commanded it thus, it was said, so that people would remember both the punishment and the blessing. Plutarch recalls another circumstance of the flood, when he says, "It is reported that a dove sent from the ark announced to Deucalion the tempest when it returned, and fair weather when it remained outside." Other Greek writers call Ogyges the character under whom the great cataclysm occurred. The reason for this diversity of names is easy to understand, in the same way that the Hellenes, properly so called, had a flood of Deucalion, because they regarded Deucalion as their first author. The autochthons or indigenous people of Attica had one of Ogyges, because it was with Ogyges that they began their history. It is the same for all other nations, Coxcox, Tesbi, Teocipactli in America, Phohi in China, Satyavrata, Menu in India, Zisithrus in Assyria, Ogyges and Deucalion among the Greeks. It is always the same flood that destroyed the antediluvian world and began a new world. It is always the same Noah, father of a new generation, whom each people wants to have as their first author, in which all are right, for, fundamentally, he was the first author and the first king of all peoples. The main circumstances are the same, and everywhere designate a single and same principal event. Even the epochs, different as they may first appear, accord with the various texts of the Bible. According to the Greek and Samaritan texts, Noah's flood would have taken place around 3,100 years before Jesus Christ. Now, according to the calculation of a very learned Orientalist, the Indian flood of Satyavrata, or Menu, would date back to 3,101, the Chinese flood of Kongfong to 3,082. As for the Greek flood of Ogyges, the most learned of Romans, Varro, placed it in 2376 before Jesus Christ, which agrees, within 27 years, with the Hebrew text which places Noah's flood in 2349. Everyone will agree that for such remote antiquity, one could not hope for more agreement. Evidence of the flood, drawn from geology and archaeology, not only does all of mankind rise to attest to us, through the whole of its history, that God punished it with a flood, nearly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, and that we are a generation renewed by water, the very stones, plants, animals, mountains, abysses, continents, and seas tell us the same thing. The earth, fractured in places down to its core, its various layers, thrown into each other like waves of a furious ocean, mountains, plains, valleys, receiving enormous piles of petrified shells, fish, and marine plants, elephants from Asia and Africa, buried in Great Britain, Egyptian crocodiles, buried in German lands, bones of American fish, and whale skeletons, lost in the sands of our continent, everywhere, embedded in stone, leaves, plants, fruits whose species are unknown to us, or which are only found in climates far removed from ours. These are irrefutable witnesses of a universal flood, and the frightful upheaval it produced on our globe. The ancients had not noticed these facts. Their observation has become, in our time, a new science, known as geology or earth science. The more this science progresses, the more it becomes convinced that the earth itself is the erst historical monument of the revolutions it has undergone. Kings, not content with having the great events of their reign written on paper, perpetuate their memory in marble and bronze. Likewise God, not content with having Moses write down the frightening wonders of his justice and power, has petrified their history across the entire earth. One of the scholars who contributed most to making geology a true science, and who, with this goal, traveled the entire length of Asia and a notable part of the two largest mountain ranges, tells us himself that he was convinced by his own observations of the reality of the flood, this catastrophe, which he admits, he says, he could not conceive of its plausibility before having travelled these shores and seen for himself all that could serve as evidence for this memorable event. He found on the mountains of Siberia several complete carcasses of elephants, and other animals still covered with their skin, even a rhinoceros whose skin, tendons, ligaments, and cartilages still remained. He necessarily concluded that only a general and progressive flood, such as Moses' flood, could have forced the elephants to reach the mountain tops, or could have brought their corpses there. Siberia, being the highest region of Asia, must have been submerged last, and it is there naturally that living beings must have preferred to take refuge, especially if, as all appearances suggest, the waters came particularly from the east and south, as can be concluded from the large number of plants from India and China found in very distant provinces. What has preserved these corpses for so many centuries is the excessive cold that continuously exists in these mountains. Since these animals only live in the torrid zone, it must be concluded that when the water brought them or surprised them in Siberia, the temperature there was extremely mild, whether it was already so beforehand, or whether God made it so only during the flood, and to melt the polar ice. As the waters receded, the cold would have come to imprint the seal of eternity on these singular monuments of our history. Not only does the earth bear everywhere the indelible imprint of the flood, there are even places where it records its years. For example, every year, Rains and melted snow carry earth down from mountains and hills into rivers and streams, which the rivers then carry and deposit partly in neighboring countryside and partly in the sea. Through these successive and continuous deposits, the riverbed rises as well as the plains they flood, and the sea retreats at their mouths. This can be seen in Egypt, where, through the annual deposits of the Nile, both the riverbed and the lands it regularly submerges are considerably higher than they were centuries ago. New promontories, formed at its mouth, increasingly encroach upon the ocean. The cities of Rosetta and Damietta, built on the seashore less than 1,000 years ago, are now 2 leagues away from it. The same is true in Italy. We know from Strabo's testimony that, in Augustus's time, Ravenna was in the lagoons, as Venice is today, and now Ravenna is a league from the shore. Adria in Lombardy, which gave its name to the sea and was its main port 20-some centuries ago, is now 6 leagues away from it. The Po River, since the time it was confined by dikes, has raised its bed so considerably that the surface of its waters is currently higher than the rooftops of houses in Ferrara. At the same time, its deposits have advanced into the sea with such rapidity that, comparing ancient maps with the present state, one sees that the shoreline has gained more than 6,000 toises since 1604, which amounts to 150 or 180 feet, and in some places 200 feet per annum. Now, by knowing what a river deposits in alluvium within a given time, one can calculate, from the total existing deposits, approximately since what epoch this river began to flow, approximately since what epoch the mountains and hills began to crumble due to snow and rain. In a word, approximately since what epoch our globe has been in its present state. This calculation has been made, and it is found that these annals of the earth accord with the annals of peoples. It is one of the results, at once the best proven and least expected of sound geology, says the man of our days most capable of judging thereof, a result all the more precious, as it binds with an uninterrupted chain natural history and civil history. I therefore think, he concluded, along with Eminem, Deluge, and Dolomieu, that if anything is established in geology, it is that the surface of our globe has been victim to a great and sudden revolution, whose date cannot go back much beyond 5,000 to 6,000 years. That this revolution submerged and caused to disappear the countries previously inhabited by humans and the animal species best known today. That it, conversely, exposed the bottom of the last sea and formed from it the countries inhabited today. That it is since this revolution that the small number of individuals spared by it have spread and propagated on the newly exposed lands, and consequently that it is only since this time that our societies have resumed a progressive course, that they have formed establishments, erected monuments, collected natural facts, and developed scientific systems. Therefore both Moses and peoples, earth and sea, sciences and arts, all attest to the terrible fulfillment of these words, spoken to the first Noah, I will destroy mankind with the earth. All of this also guarantees the future fulfillment of these other words, spoken to another Noah, to the pilot of the second ark, to the prince of apostles. The present heavens and earth are reserved for fire until the day of judgment. The elements will be dissolved by heat. There will be new heavens and a new earth, where justice will dwell, placed between these two formidable catastrophes. Let us learn from the first, so that we need not fear the second. This is the conclusion drawn by St. Peter.